The mountains kept their slow, indifferent breathing. Wind moved through the pines and the dry grasses like a hand brushing a sleeping face. The arroyo gurgled beneath the old stone bridge as if it remembered every footstep that had ever crossed it. In the village, doors exhaled, hinges admonished by time, shutters clicked against panes. A dog that had never barked at strangers whined once and lay back down. It was the kind of evening that made grief seem ordinary, a thing that belonged to the house and the fields rather than to the sky. If you like stories that unfold like a chill on the skin, stay with this one until the end. Subscribe and like if the atmosphere moves you. Your silence does not warm the night. Music cue, low cello, wind swell. Andres had been in his father's house since noon, when the neighbors' voices had come soft and then sharper against the walls. They had brought bread and a pot of caldo and the awkward, practical things that people bring to a family whose living man had been taken by something that looked formless even in its certainty. Juan's back had stopped working. His hands had stopped. He had simply lain down and stopped. There was talk of fever. There always was. But there were also whispers that he had gone into the arroyo the week before and spoken with a man who had no face by lamplight. Andres had laughed the first time he heard that. He had to laugh, because what else did you do when your father's life peeled away and left a small, empty space where a future had been stacked? The house smelled of boiled coffee and beeswax. The family bed where Juan had slept was made damp with the storm outside and the grief inside. Later, they would say that even the sheets carried the weight of his breath, that some houses kept the shape of their dead. For now, the room where Juan's body lay was a single space of candlelight and people. A wooden coffin rested on sawhorses. Maria, his mother, sat close to the coffin with a shawl over her head, hands clenched as if clinging to something the room could not contain. Her lips moved in fragments of Hail Marys, and every so often she would glance at Andres with a look that was both pleading and accusation, as though she blamed him for not knowing what had hidden in Juan's silence. Padre Julian arrived with his cassock still carrying the smell of incense from the parish. He moved through the house like a man who had practiced calm, small gestures, small prayers, the sign of the cross drawn on foreheads and coffins with a thumb that quivered only once. His prayers were brief and exact, Spanish soft as moth wings, and when he wanted a stronger voice, he let loose a single phrase in Latin that the old women hummed like an answer, more out of tradition than faith. He pronounced the rites the way a farmer would lay a fence, with hands that knew work and with the certainty that some things must be done, even when the reason for doing them has been forgotten. Neighbors came in clusters, then alone. Men took off their hats in the doorway, voices lowered as if the house could overhear them. Children, sent away by stern eyes, clustered under the eaves and watched with a curiosity that was almost pure and therefore dangerous. Someone, at some point, mentioned Juan's debt. The phrase dropped like a pebble into the pool of voices and made concentric ripples. He borrowed, somebody said. He owed a man for seed, for a roof. Another voice corrected, softer. Not for seed, for something else, for a favor, for a promise. The word passed through the room like smoke. Andres heard it all, but kept his face a plain thing. He tried to anchor himself to the practical, the need to bury, the need to call the registry in the next town, the need to keep Maria from unraveling. He had the sturdiness of the field in his palms, calluses, the curve of fingers that knew how to mend a fence and how to coax life from stubborn soil. Yet every time the word promise touched the air, something small in his chest trembled and would not steady. "You should speak," his sister-in-law whispered at one point, touching his arm. "Tell them, Andres, tell them there was nothing. Tell them there was—" "What would saying do?" he murmured. "Words are only words. He was my father." He wanted to believe the easiest thing, that Juan had made mistakes, maybe borrowed, maybe lied, maybe drank, but that no old man had bartered his son's soul for a sack of blessing. But the village had bones like all villages. The story sank into the rock and became true by repetition. There had been talk, years ago, of a night when Juan had come back from the arroyo with his coat full of wet leaves and a smile that did not suit him. People had taken him aside then. They had asked him if he'd gone to seek help for the land, if he'd sold the last of his seeds to some trader. Juan had answered with evasions and a hand clenching the air as if to hold something invisible. After that, his luck had turned for a while. He had the money for medicine, for a roof board, for a horse's shoe. It had been small miracles, small enough to be tempting, large enough to be noticed. It was nearly midnight when the stranger came. He did not arrive with fanfare. He came by foot, following the lane that creaked between hedgerows, his silhouette swallowed by the dark like ink dropped into water. The dogs outside let out a single, low chorus, then stilled. Someone left the doorway to see, and said later that the man was taller than most, draped in a black coat that seemed to drink the light. He moved without the rocking gait of a traveler. He moved instead like a shadow that has decided to settle its weight on a specific place. There was no hat. There was a hood. Where a face should have been, the room felt empty, as if the candlelight had been drawn into a small hole and no shape remained to cast it back. He entered the house with a calm that made the air colder, an arrival that had the exact economy of a thing that knew its rights. Everyone fell into a silence that was both polite and terrified. Maria pulled her shawl tighter. Padre Julian stood up, crossed at his chest, and made to say something, but the sound that came from his lips was not a prayer. It was a name, the kind of name that asks a question of the world. "Who are you?" The man inclined his head, and, when he answered, the sound scraped like a wind through dry reeds. His voice was low and folded in on itself. When he said, "I come for what has been promised," the effect in the room was not merely the content of the sentence, but the way it sat in the air, as if every small object took a breath and held it. Padre Julian moved forward then, his hands open and practiced. "This is a house of mourning," he said, voice steady now. "This man is dead, and there will be prayers. You cannot take." "I do not take," the stranger said. "I collect." Words like that have a habit of changing the geometry of a room. It was as if the walls leaned in. Andres felt the floor cool through his sandals. He stood then, because movement seemed the only honest response when the world rotated its axis a few degrees. Up close, the stranger's hood was not fabric alone. It seemed to have an edge to it, a texture that drank light and reflected hunger. From within the hood, two small points of light flared, tiny, slow, red like embers. They did not glow as eyes do. They shone with the sharpness of something that had turned its attention inward and found a route. "Who promised you?" Andres asked, his own voice less steady than he wanted. The man laughed once, a small sound that might have been wind in a chimney. "Promises bloom in men like weeds," he said. "They need tending. Someone watered this one and expected it to remain their secret." Padre Julian crossed himself. He said, in a voice that was human in its faltering, "In the name of the Father, the Son—" "I am not unaccustomed to prayers," the stranger replied. "Prayers are clever. They make men feel they are doing something, even as they are losing breath." He stepped closer to the coffin, close enough that the waxed lid gleamed in the candlelight. His hand came out of the gutter of his sleeve, and for a moment it was simply a pale thing, like a bone or a stone warmed by some distant sun. He laid it on the coffin lid and left it there, a touch that did not press, but that the wood seemed to drink. The effect was immediate. The candles guttered as if someone had passed a hand between them and the wick. The room's breath became audible, a collective inhalation. A wind, not the mountain wind, but an inner current, moved through the house, tangling the shawls and the prayers, slipping around chair legs like fingers seeking seams. Someone called out, a neighbor, "Padre, do something." And Padre Julian did the thing that had always steadied him. He whispered a litany of names, traced the sign of the cross with trembling certainty, invoked saints and quick prayers he had learned as a child. But the wind did not leave. Instead, it settled, as if preference had been declared. It found Maria. She rose without a sound, as if someone else had been standing behind her and held her by the elbows. Her hands went to the coffin, fingers fumbling for the lid, as if she had always known where to put them. Andres reached for her then, because the world had become a machine that needed his intervention. "Mama," he said, voice strangled, "no." Her eyes were open, and in them something flickered that was not grief. It was recognition that burned colder than a lighthouse. She looked not at him, but past him, toward the doorway, toward the dark where the hooded figure had stood, with his hand resting on the coffin's wood. "It is time," she said, softly, with no surprise on her face. Her voice had a cadence that belonged to someone remembering a story she had been told long ago. "He has come." "Do you hear me?" Andres demanded, louder than he meant. "Do you know what you say? This is not— Mama, please!" She smiled then, and it was the wrong sort of smile. Not cruel, but resigned. "He keeps his bargains," she said. "We all keep what we promised." Padre Julian moved between them, a human barrier. He placed himself in front of the coffin as if he could be a hinge that the stranger could not pass. "By the power of God," he intoned, voice steadier than his hands, "I bind every claim that is unrightfully made in this house. Depart, creature of the night, leave these people to their mourning. The man in black tilted his head in what passed for a nod. You may try to bind me, he said, amusement ghosting his tone. But bindings are only strings until someone chooses to be tied. He took his hand from the coffin at that, the pale thing withdrawing like a tide. The coffin beneath it creaked, the faint, honest sound of wood responding to weight. Andrés leaned over the lid, fingers white-knuckled at the edge. He wanted to lift it himself, to prove that what he feared was only form and nothing more. But the wood now had the temperature of a grave on a winter morning. Cold, dense, final. The candles threw sickly shadows. The faces around him were pinched and small, mouths moving in prayers that had the rhythm of pleading. Then, as if a laugh was a key, the sound came. It was not a man's laugh, nor a child's. It was a sound that layered itself with the timbre of wind through an empty bottle and the thin note of distant, unplaceable bells. It rolled low and pleased. The neighbors swayed. The children by the eaves swallowed the urge to cry. And Maria, who had been a woman of small, practical fears, stared at the lid as, with a gentleness that was not her own, pushed. For a breath, one small, terrible breath, the coffin resisted. The lid moved a fraction, like the beginning of a sigh, and the smell that rolled out was not rotting flesh or candle wax, but the smell of earth turned over, and the first wet odor of rain on clay. It smelled of the arroyo in spring, of the place where Juan had been seen speaking to someone by lamplight. Andrés shoved forward, hands under the lid, as if to wrench it open. His palms met cold grain, and then nothing. The lid shifted, and then bumped against something heavy. A sound under the wood rose, a long, hollow note that could have been a word, or could have been the sound of a thing remembering how to be loud. Padre Julian cried out a prayer, Latin loud and ragged now, but the syllables were swallowed by that hollow sound. The red points of light in the stranger's hood intensified. They shed no light, only an accusation. "It is not yet time," the man said, and his voice was like the wind turning a page. Patience is part of keeping a bargain. Someone screamed then, one sharp human sound, and in the space of a blink Maria's hand left the coffin as if it had grown a weight that she could not sustain. She staggered back. Her shawl fell from her head and exposed her hair in the candlelight. And in that strip of exposed neck Andrés thought he saw a mark, pale and circular, as if someone had pressed a ring too often into skin. But the sight was gone almost as soon as it had come. Maria's face was a mask of puzzlement, rubbing at her throat, as if awakening from a dream. "He's taking something else," she whispered, to no one and to everyone, and then she looked at Andrés with a grief that had become a blade. "He takes what was promised. It is not fair, hijo." And in that moment, when Maria's voice trembled and the coffin stuttered between closed and open like a mouth considering speech, the world reduced itself to lines. The curve of the hooded man's shoulder, the small flame of the candle on the sill that flared and then became obedient, the shout of Padre Julian's prayer, Andrés's hands on the wood, and the sound, deeper now, as if something under the lid had found a shape and was inhaling. The lid gave a fraction more, then a sliver, and the light from within the coffin was a color the room had no name for, the husk of an ember, the thin smear of dawn before the sun arrives. The low, inhuman laughter pooled like oil at the edges of the house. The hooded man leaned over the coffin and spoke into that small space, as if to a friend. "You remembered well," he said. "They remember." Andrens had one motion left that felt like a prayer or a blasphemy. He reached with both hands to wrench open the lid and pull whatever had been promised back into the only life he could imagine. The lid shuddered as if protesting the attempt. Something warm met his palms, not flesh, not the heat of breath, but a thin, living pressure, like a pulse pressed against paper. It beat once, twice, and the sound that exhaled from under the wood was a child's voice, small and thin and impossibly clear in that cramped dark. "Mama," it whispered, and then the house let out its sound, a single, long exhale that could have been relief or a prelude to terror. Andres froze, the entire movement of his body hanging on that syllable. The light in the hooded man's eyes tightened into two small instruments of focus. The neighbor nearest the door pressed a hand to his mouth, and Padre Julian, who had been the picture of composure, looked suddenly like a man who had mislaid the map of the world. Outside, the wind rose as if an unseen bell had been rung. The sound of the arroyo swelled until it matched the pitch of the laughter. The hooded man straightened slowly and turned toward Maria, who had stumbled forward as if drawn by the voice from the coffin. He spread his hands in a motion that was both invitation and closing of a circuit. "The claim is clean," he said. "The bargain holds when the binding is kept." Andres felt the last of his practical certainties fall away. He had supposed bargains were things you read about in old people's tales to frighten children into obedience. He had supposed that debts were money or work or apologies. He had never, not in a private thought, considered that promises could be held like objects waiting on a shelf, later to be taken down by someone with colder fingers. He lunged. He reached for Maria, for the child's voice. He shoved past neighbors, knocking an elbow into a bowl of water that splashed and hissed against the wooden floor. His fingers closed on cloth and then on nothing, and the house tilted as if someone had pressed a palm against its side. But when his hands came back, they held only air and a smear of damp soil, as if the thing that had been there had been pulled like a thread through the fabric of the world. Maria stumbled and fell into Andres's arms, and for a frightful instant he thought she was asleep. Then her knees buckled, and something in her gaze had gone faint, as if the light behind her eyes had been taken on a long walk. The hooded man took one step back from the coffin, and the red points in his hood blinked as if closing a lid. He did not look triumphant. Triumph would have been too human. He looked, instead, like a farmer marking rows, satisfied at a job that was not cruelty, but occupation. "There is balance," he said. Padre Julian dropped to his knees and began to pray with a fervor that was meant to patch a hole in the sky. Rapid Latin phrases that seemed to spill from him like pebbles thrown into a well. The people around the house joined in, a chorus of fear stitched into the old words. The songs climbed like ladders and then collapsed, not because they were ineffective, but because the world did not respond the way their habits required. Then the stranger turned to leave. He did not run, he did not hurry. He moved with the same slow, terrible certainty with which a winter moves into a valley. As he passed the doorway, he paused and tipped his head as if in courtesy, and in the dark beneath his hood the red lights flared one last time, two small coals in a face that was otherwise empty. Outside, the wind took up the laughter and carried it across the arroyo, over the stone bridge, through the hedges, and into the teeth of the night, where the houses breathed and pretended to sleep. The candles guttered and steadied. The neighbors stayed in the doorway like people who had been warned not to cross a boundary. Someone cried out for help, and someone else made the motion of carrying Maria to a chair. Andres stood in the circle of light that remained around the coffin and felt something have been stolen that could not be described with any available word. The roof creaked. The smoke from the neighbor's delayed cigarette curled like a slow question mark. He sank down on his heels beside the lid and pressed his forehead to the wood as if he could hear the child's heartbeat through it. There was nothing. The world outside the house went on. The arroyo babbled. A cat slipped across a wall. A distant lamp blinked like a human eyelid. Padre Julian, pale and small under his collar, came to Andres and put both hands on his shoulders as if he could grant steadiness by pressure alone. "We will pray," he said, voice hoarse. "We will bury him rightly. We will ask for help." Andres laughed then, a short sound that tasted like a coin gone bitter. "Help?" he echoed. "Help from whom? From saints who have their hands full? From a God who lets bargains be kept?" Padre Julian's mouth tightened. He had no answer to that. There are not always answers to such edges of fate. He only said, "We must bury him. We must do what the living can do." They prepared the body with hands that trembled less now than before, working with the kind of mechanical care grief teaches. The coffin was closed and lifted at dawn. The village followed in a procession that resembled any other, steps measured to respect, the clump of shoes on earth, the rustle of shawls, the low intonation of prayers. But in the moment the coffin slid into the earth, something in Andres loosened and then tightened again. He thought of the child's voice, impossibly small and present, and he saw in his mind the red lights of the hooded man's hood, burning through the night like a pair of distant lanterns. They covered the grave with soil and stones. The priest threw 3 handfuls of earth, an ancient ritual that smelled of dust and the faint tang of rain. The neighbors made their crossings and said the things people say to the dead, words of memory, small blessings. Maria did not stand at the grave. She had stayed at the house, her eyes vacant, as if she watched 2 halves of a tale at once. She whispered once, barely audible, "He keeps his bargains," and then she lapsed in silence. When the crowd had thinned and the churchyard emptied like a pan of cooled milk, Andres remained behind. He crouched at the edge of the fresh mound, fingers digging into damp soil, and in the hollow of the new grave there was a smell that was not quite of death nor of the earth. It was the scent of a night's promise kept, and a morning that had remembered a debt. He tried to think of ways to fix the thing, as if a bargain were a broken wheel or a fence to mend. He thought of asking Padre Julian to challenge it in the pulpit, to consult a priest from the city, to call for a rosary and a procession until their voices had worn the air into safety. But the strongest thing he felt was a thin thread of a question that would not unravel. Who else had been promised? Who else in the village had tied a secret bargain in a desperate night? The knowledge sat under his ribs like a splinter. As he stood to leave, the wind shifted, and the arroyo answered with a sound like paper sliding over glass. From somewhere beyond the pines, a laugh rose faint and then faded, and in its wake the hair on Andres's arms prickled, as if something had walked past him and not turned to see. He turned his back on the grave and walked toward the house. The door swung inward with an old complaint. Inside, Maria sat by the coffin, which was closed now, her hands empty, her breath a thin thing. She looked up as he came in, and for a second there was recognition. "They will come," she said to him, in a voice that belonged to a woman remembering a myth, as if it were a weather report. Andres reached for words to say, a plan to make, a defiance to hold. Instead, he found his palms empty, and the house full of shadows that moved of their own accord. In the corner where the stranger had sat, the floor was still colder, and when Andres set a candle there, it burned a color that did not fit the rest. He shut the door and bolted it with the bar he had used since he was a boy, the iron key scraping a sound like a small protest. The house did not feel safer. The wind threaded the shutters like a needle, and beyond the window the arroyo shone black and patient. When he finally lay down that night, it was not to sleep, but to stay awake and listen to the world reorder itself. He heard in the thick hush the sound of something moving in the distance, a measured footfall, the low rustle of a coat, the faint chuckle of a collector walking between houses as if counting. He imagined the hooded man crossing the bridge, his two red lights guiding him like landmarks. He imagined him keeping his ledger, careful and unhurried. Andres thought of promises as things that could be cut, and also as things that could rip. He thought of his father standing by the arroyo, of the smile that did not suit, of the coins or favor or despair that might have led a man to barter. He thought of people who were hungry enough to trade, and of debt collectors who were patient enough to wait generations. He thought of the child's voice from the coffin, and the way Maria had turned at it as if to a bell. He could not sleep. He listened to the house breathe and the wind answer. In the doorway of his mind a question lay like a seed. Could a bargain be undone once it was kept? He turned the question over and over like a stone finding its edge. Beyond the house and the arroyo and the village, the mountains kept their slow breathing. Somewhere on the ridge a light winked like an eye. The hooded man had traveled back into the dark with his claim intact. The wind, which had been the first to notice him, continued to move through the pines as if to remember the route he had taken. Andres stayed awake until dawn, when the first thin light made the house look like a thing that had been forgiven and would not be. He thought that perhaps he would speak to Padre Julian. Perhaps he would set out to find who had made the promise or how to unravel it. He thought those practical, human things as if they were tools. But as the sun rose and the village returned to its small chores, milk, plow, mending fences, Andres carried with him the knowledge that some bargains were not traded in coin and could not be undone with work. He carried the feel of the coffin's lid warm under his palms, the sound of the laugh in his ears, and the image of two red lights disappearing down the lane. When he stepped outside, he noticed with a quiet and terrible clarity that something else was different. A child's shoe lay under a hedge near the path, a small mud-caked thing that had not been there the night before. It was too small for Juan's age, too new for the villagers' children, and it had a scuff on the toe that looked like the imprint of a small animal's paw. Andres stooped and picked it up. The leather was soft and smelled faintly of river algae. He turned it over in his hands and felt, not for the first time since the night before, the precise weight of an impossible bargain. He raised his head toward the arroyo, toward the bridge where the stranger had walked, and listened to the lullaby of water. Behind that sound was the quiet knowledge that the claim had been made, and, somewhere, a ledger kept its neat columns. The question settled in the bones of the village like frost. Who else had been promised, and when at last would the bargain's hunger come again?